So in this video, we're going to look at our second type of charging. So just a reminder, our last type of charging was charging by friction. You have two objects, you rub them together, and one ends up positive, one ends up negative. Here we're going to look at charging by conduction. You can also sometimes call this charging by contact. So I'll sometimes call it charging by contact. If we ever talk about charging by contact, it's charging by induction. So in charging by conduction, let's take a look at what it is. We have two objects with different amounts of charge. So already this is different from charging by friction. Charging by friction, we had two neutral objects. Now we've got a neutral object and we've got a charged object. So let's go ahead and let's see what happens when they come in contact. So we've got our neutral object has now come in contact with our charged object. You can see our neutral object has equal numbers of positives and negatives, and you can see our charged object has way more negatives than it does positives. So what's going to happen is electrons are going to move from one object to another. Remember, only the electrons move, the protons do not move, so the electrons are going to move from one object to another. The electrons are always going to move to whatever object has fewer electrons. So I want you to take a second and I want you to look and see which one has fewer electrons, the ball or the rod. If you notice, the ball has way more electrons than the rod does. So the electrons are going to move to wherever there are fewer electrons, they're going to move to the rod. So we're going to see our electrons are going to move to our rod. And now let's see what our ball looks like and what our rod looks like. So before we get to that, just a reminder of which way the electrons are always going to move. They are always going to move to the object with larger electrical charge. They're always going to move from the object with larger electrical charge to smaller electrical charge. So we've got our object on the left had a larger electrical charge. It had more negatives. Our object on the right had a smaller electrical charge, it had fewer negatives. So we always move from the object with more electrons to the object with less electrons. Now let's take a look at what our object looked like before and after. So before, we had our rod was neutral and our ball was negative. After they touch, we had those electrons move from the ball to the rod. And now what happens is after our rod is negative and our ball is also negative. So our rod has gained electrons. It has an overall negative charge. Our ball still has more negatives than it does have positives, so it also has an overall negative charge. So in charging by conduction, you have a neutral object and a charged object that are going to rub together, and they are going to result in the same charge. So charging by friction, two neutral objects rub together, they result in a different charge. Here we have a neutral object and a charged object, and they are going to result in the same charge that the charged object had. So in this case, since our charged object was negative, they both result in a negative charge. And that's it. That's how charging by conduction works. So next up, we're going to take a look at our last type of charging, and that's going to be charging by induction.